Whooping Crane Chronicles is a collection of stories to learn from, to ponder, and to celebrate. I'm Mike Forsberg, a conservation photographer from the Great Plains. I've spent the last 5 years, camera in hand, exploring the natural history of whooping cranes across the continent, meeting the people who love them, and discovering how these tall, magnificent, and rarest of cranes are navigating our 21st century world. This podcast elevates conservation stories and uplifts these birds to showcase their natural history and beauty in the hope of keeping these birds around for generations to come. Join me on the journey. So we are here in south central Nebraska, right in the heart of the Great Plains of North America, and right smack in the middle of the pinch in the hourglass of the Central Flyway. And it's late July, and it is hotter than blazes outside. It's like 100 degrees in the shade, with Don Cox, who's a landowner here in the Trumbull Basin, which is part of the larger rainwater basins that are in just south of the Platte River. And we're with Rick Rasmussen, who lives up, as Rick says, about 15 minutes north of here. Rick is a photographer, landowner, and both of these guys are quietly conservation heroes of mine that you'll learn a lot more about today, not just through the things that they've done in their lives for conservation, but you actually get to hear a little bit about their hearts and why they care. And that's a really important thing that we do in conservation today is not just get to the nuts and bolts, but we really get to the why. So I'll start on my right here with Don. Why don't you tell us a little bit about where you're from, Don, and what your background is and so forth.
All right. Well, I was actually born in Lincoln, Nebraska.
Dang,
not in the
really
country club area per se, but I remember crawling under the fence at Lincoln Country Club getting golf balls and that sort of thing. But our family relocated to Hastings in 1963 when I was 7 years old. So do the math.
Right.
But part of the rationale my dad used to, it's never easy to move, but part of the rationale he used is, Don, the hunting's a lot better out in that part of than it is around Lincoln. So, of course, I was only 7, so I wasn't carrying a gun yet. But so we moved out here in 63, lived here for a lot of years, went through the Hastings public school system, graduated high school in 74. When I went to college, I said I will never go back to that community. I have no desire to go back. But it's funny how life treats you. I started work in 1981 in Grand Island for a utility company. I got transferred in 86. I got divorced in 89. My ex-wife and daughter moved back to Lincoln. Mm-hmm. A good friend of mine told me about a job that Hastings Utilities was posting at the time. It happened to be in my area of expertise, which was natural gas deregulation. Long story short, in 92, I moved back. And been here ever since. I love the community, but I was in the utility business for 37 years and I retired about 6 years ago. And now Lisa, my wife, and we pretty much just do all the maintenance out here on the properties. And I said it when I retired, it's one of those jobs that you could work 40 hours a week, 60 hours a week easily if you wanted to. There's no end to what you can do out here.
Well, thanks, Don. Good segue to Rick, I think, because Rick, you said you're 15, 20 minutes from here.
Yeah.
Don lives in the middle of the rainwater basins. You live up in the Platte Valley.
That's right. I do. And I grew up in Grand Island. Yeah. Lived there all my life. Grand Island Senior High, graduated in 1975. I ended up working for my uncle at, it's called Jack's Tire, which my grandfather started in 1928. So I worked through there up until where I bought the place and became owner. Worked there for 40 years and retired almost 10 years ago. Kind of retired. I'm busy in March with crane season. But so I bought an acreage south of town that I've had for about 32 years. And I made sure it had to be in the Big Bend area of the Platte River because I've been addicted to sandhill cranes all my life. So I had to be within the migration.
Cool. So you guys know each other, right?
Not really. I mean, we didn't.
I think, Don's wife used to come into the tire shop, and she told me years ago, and it's like, yeah, we've got a wetland. If you ever come out and photograph, and I never did, but now since I'm out here, probably not see me.
Might help if we had more water, but
Yeah, well, I'm not going to photograph this time of year. It's golf season, so
yeah.
So Rick, you haven't mentioned your photography yet. And,
Right.
and that is a way that feels like to me and that's how I know you
right.
first and foremost, and it's a way you connect with the world.
Yeah, so the photography, I got into that when I grew up. I was one of 5 kids. I was the only boy. I was right in the middle. So my dad loved to hunt and fish, and so he took me hunting and fishing all the time, and that's how my love of nature began. And later in the years, I started taking pictures, and I started photographing instead of shooting. I was lucky enough when I was in 8th grade, they offered a photography class. So I was developing and printing my own black and white in 8th grade. And the camera I used, my grandfather gave me that I still have. And it's a Kodak Pony 35 millimeter camera. I still have it to this day sitting in my office. So I started doing nature and wildlife photography. Of course, my goal was to be as good as the Nebraska land photographers. I always watched your photography and many other people before you. And it's like, gosh, I knew how to get close to wildlife because I was a hunter, but I just couldn't afford those expensive lenses. And so my quality of my photography just wasn't where it should have been. And finally, when I started getting better lenses, the quality of my work improved. And and I think the first time I met you, okay, help me out, Crane Meadows Nature Center.
Right, yeah.
When they first started, where the Crane Trust Nature and Visitor Center is now, the Bosman family had a gas station out there. They ended up closing it up and giving it to a local group, and they started in a trailer out there. And they had a little art show at one time that I set up with, and you were set up there too, right? That's the first time I remember meeting you. Yeah. I was thrilled.
Well,
you're my idol.
All right.
Give him a big hit.
There's silliness here. The first time that you and I went into the field together was actually down in the rainwater basins. So Rick invited me, or maybe I invited myself. I don't know how that worked out, but we went to photograph snow geese together at Holteen, which is not. I mean, it's east a ways, right? South of Aurora, maybe. So, but we got out these little Leonard LaRue single-person blinds and set them up side by side and sat on 5-gallon buckets in the middle of the night and could hear the hum of the geese off in the distance. And then when the light came on, there they were. And, cranes are an amazing creature to photograph. But I'll tell you, those snow geese coming and going like that, that's every bit as remarkable. And then you throw in the pintails. And the mallards and the gadwalls and the whole parade of the Central Flyway, and it's crazy. And I don't think most people have any idea. Don, what's your perfect day during migration season? What would be a perfect day if you could just sort of wipe away all the responsibilities that you have and everything else? What's that look like?
Well, the beauty of it here is we have our typical routine. We get up in the morning, we have the coffee pot going, open the shades, sit on the couch, look out, and when we have water out there, just watching the birds come in. I don't do a lot of things like Rip does, like go out and sit in the blind for hours on end to get a photograph. But I've always said if I didn't have a dog, I have a nice black lab, but if I didn't have a dog, I wouldn't hunt. But I might hunt with a camera. Right. Because to me, the shooting is not it. It's watching the enthusiasm the dog has and watching the dog retrieve.
Yeah. How about you, Rick? What's your perfect day?
Oh, well, perfect day is springtime in the migration. Like I have a little marsh that I built that I flood in the springtime. And so waterfowl is probably one of my favorite things to photograph because I used to hunt waterfowl, but I don't anymore. But watching him hook up and come in, especially at like white-fronted geese, one of my favorites. It's just incredible. But so that's the first part of the migration, which is wonderful. And then you get the overlap. Then the sandhill cranes start coming in. And I've watched sandhill cranes or photographed them all my life. And I'm still like a little kid at Christmas when I hear or see the first ones. If I'm outside, I'll won't even run in. I'll call my wife. It's like, I hear cranes or I see cranes. And then the next 6 weeks or 2 months almost is just incredible with the watching the numbers build on the river and, sit on the deck and watch them. I don't sit on the deck a lot and watch them fly back to the river from the cornfields, which is really a cool sight because I'm usually sitting in a blind waiting for them to come back. But the sandhill cranes they just got my heart, and they just absolutely love them. And when I was in my business, and you're probably going to ask this later, but when the Hoopie Crane Maintenance Trust first got started in 1978, I had a lot of farmers for customers. They would come in and they say, they're buying this land up and they're not paying property taxes because they're nonprofit. And I correct them. It's like, they are nonprofit and they don't have to pay property taxes, but they want to be good neighbors. Yeah. And so they voluntarily pay property taxes. I'd have people come in all the time and ask, I don't know what the big deal is about sandhill cranes. And that was a big mistake because then I would start rambling on. It's like, we have one of the greatest migrations in North America. We have 80% of one species of bird in one small area here. And they're like, oh.
Well, they're stuck because you've got their tires too, don't you?
Oh yeah, they were stuck. So I educated a lot of people down there, and a lot of people were interested in listening to it and didn't realize, even though they lived here all their lives, and didn't realize what we had.
Well, let's switch gears to these big, tall, white birds that can nearly look us in the eye here. Mm-hmm. Rick, I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to ask you, do you remember the first time you saw a whooping crane?
I think I remember when it was, but I don't remember the year. Yeah. Because I just, but I do remember because it's such a sight to see. And I think it was, I got some, back in the film days, I got some terrible pictures of them. I think there was like 4 at the time, and they were just a few miles from my house. But of course, before I built my house where I live, a friend of mine was building a block garage, and we're building it. And it was springtime and, like in April. Mm-hmm. But I had Hooper fly right over top. And
So here's a couple questions for you. Follow up. You talked about the single sandhill crane or single whooping cranes that we see every spring. Everybody's got a different idea of what's going on there.
Yeah.
And they all call him Bob.
He's
right?
Bob.
Yeah, it's Bob. So I think there's a lot of Bobs. Frankly.
There's a lot of
Bobs. I don't
Bobs,
think that there's one Bob.
The original Bob probably passed away a long time ago. But everybody calls it Bob.
Probably so. So what do you think? What do you think's going on with those
with the single ones?
Yeah,
I think it's probably just a juvenile that's was migrating and just I don't know for sure, but I'm not a biologist, but instructing. But I just assume it's a juvenile that's started migrating with them. And
so when we say juvenile, we're talking about birds that are teenagers.
Right.
They're subadults, so they've made the migration once down and back with mom and dad, and then when they get back up to close to their breeding grounds, then mom and dad say, see you later.
Yeah.
And so then those birds bounce around, usually for about 3 years or so, and find others of like kind. And likely they oftentimes find their mates. The telemetry studies that have been ongoing now since 2009, some of the focus has been on these younger birds now, and they're doing some pretty wild things. They don't always follow the book. Okay.
Right. But they have found where they have split off from the sandhill cranes they migrate with and found some of their own.
Yeah, a lot of that happens up in Canada and the northern parts of the prairies and southern boreal, or sometimes they may go up into wood buffalo, but they may hang with others of their own ilk.
Well, that's good to hear because when you see them with the sandhill cranes, it's like, well,
you sort of feel sorry for them.
Oh, you do, and they're not going to be able to reproduce and have more hoopers if they're just hanging out with the sandhill crane. So that's nice to know that they do bounce around. That is good.
Yeah,
glad to hear it.
Yeah, so they're doing all right. Don, you remember the first time you saw a whooping crane?
Well, I thought about that after I saw the question, and I do think the first time I saw them, and you guys probably remember this, you're old enough, but back in November of '95, there was a major push of all kinds of waterfowl, and it was referred to as the Grand Passage. And I happened to be hunting the next morning when that was all happening, but on that particular day, and I don't remember the exact number of whoopers, but there was 2 different groups where there was a few of them flying with sandhill cranes, and there was a few of them flying with Canada geese.
Really?
But that was the Grand Passage, I had to look it up again to see when the date was. But what I saw or what I read was there was an estimated 90 million birds came through this major migration, and it was all weather related. But they actually, a lot of the air traffic in the area, they could not tell the difference between the airplanes and the birds migrating.
Do you remember that?
Well, I remember I remember the radar that the airports were, you could follow migration with the radar from the.
And sometimes they have that these days with snow geese still.
Right.
You know,
They do.
they're in
Right.
high concentrations. But no, I was in the blind that day, and it's something I won't ever forget. And I've seen a few bobs out there too.
Simples,
and I was involved with Ducks Unlimited for over 20 years as a volunteer, but we had the state convention. We hosted it here a number of times. And one of the typical activities was take a tour up to see the cranes. And we were fortunate enough on more than one occasion to see like a single white crane out there with all the sandhills.
Right.
So that was pretty cool. But yeah, I'd go back to November 95, and maybe I saw one previously, but I just couldn't recall.
Well, I guess that pulls me up to the whooping cranes that you had in your backyard.
Mm-hmm.
So while I was working on this book project, I had some limited access to telemetry, working with the biologists on this project, and I happened to see one of the telemetry birds be in this part of the country.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had a free morning and got in my truck and I drove out and started going down the Etch-a-Sketch county roads here, and I run into Dave Bosch. Dave's
the Crane Trust
biologist, Crane Trust, and Dave's job for several years, he's now recently retired, has been to put his eyes on these birds. So I had stopped and talked to Dave, and we exchanged pleasantries and such, and saw these whooping cranes south of here. And about the same time, here comes this guy in this four-wheeler with this dog.
Mm-hmm.
It was you.
It was me.
You were right on it, man. I mean, you were. You got the 360 view right here. You're in the middle of your kingdom, right? and you and I had just met previously.
The Reiner Basin joint venture workshop. Yeah.
So that was quite something. So take the story from there.
Well, I'm going to just read a couple excerpts from the notes that I took, because I have like 10 or 11 pages. So about a page a day of when they were here. But the first day we noticed them, they must have come in on April 13th that night, because Wednesday, April 14th, 2021. I woke up to begin another normal day and opened the east shades before sitting down for a cup of coffee on the couch. It was prior to sunrise and dawn was breaking. I noticed an older maroon Honda parked southeast of our house on 82nd Street. This was a little unusual, but figured a car broke down or somebody was just viewing waterfowl in our basin, which is quite common. So I was watching the occupant through the spotting scope and got out once or twice, got back to his car, and I took the dog north in the UTV to do my trap check and came back, and the car was still sitting there. So I decided to take, I call it my buggy. It's a UTV. Okay, side by side, whatever you want to call it, but I refer to it as a buggy. But I decided to take the buggy down to see who it was, and I got about halfway down the driveway and noticed 4 large white birds sitting over on the adjacent property. And I assumed they were whoopers, but I was already out in the open by this time, so I continued to the car. I didn't ask the individual his name at that time, but he said he was watching cranes, and I told him he was more than welcome to do so, but I would appreciate it if he cleaned up everything when he left. Yeah, then the next morning is when I met you, I guess, out there, and you took that beautiful picture of my dog sitting next to me in the UTV, which that's still my favorite picture to show everybody, because he is just, he's built. But it's good. But okay, Thursday, April 15th, this is in the morning. I had a lot more notes from that first day because that was unusual. Lisa, my wife, took pictures through our spotting scope with her phone.
Those,
as soon as I got back to the house that morning, I sent a text. Well, I tried to call him already. Our Pastor Dunbar is a bird watcher.
Right, yeah.
And I sent him a text, and within 6 minutes, he was out here. So he talked to Dave Bosch, and he was, just thrilled to see the whoopers, because that's one thing he always wanted us to let him know if we saw. And we've had snowy owls on the property before in the past, and he comes out and does a lot of watching. But Thursday, April 15th, 2021, The crane trust guy, I didn't know his name at that time, was parked by the double gate to the south, and the whoopers were already out in Holland's field feeding. Plus, I saw a silver pickup, a Tacoma, further east, stopped on the road. So Jax and I decided to go see who it was on our way to check traps. I immediately recognized the individual but didn't recall his name, and it turned out to be Michael Forsberg, photographer who has done documentaries for PBS, and I had met at the Rainwater Basin Joint Workshop a short time ago. In any event, I talked to Mike for a while, and he told me about one of the cranes was outfitted with telemetry and the history of this particular bird, which I later asked him to document so I could remember all the details, and I will attach that story to these notes. Michael told me the crane trust guy's name was Dave Bosch, and Michael also said he would be interested to know if the cranes were roosting in the wetland or farm field, so I started paying more attention to their routine at that time. And I do have what you sent me text-wise for the history of the juvenile crane with the telemetry. Is very interesting.
That's funny because I brought that too.
Yeah. But that in itself is...
And I can follow up with you too. I can tell you more.
Okay. But this went on. I mean, we had people... We didn't put the word out. Okay? We didn't call the newspaper and say, hey, we got 4 whoopers out here, because we didn't want anybody to know. And a few of my close friends knew it. One of the guys I hunt with, his ex-brother-in-law, and an individual by the name of Gary Lingle came over to see him.
Yeah.
And Gary actually gave me a lot of good information on cranes and the whoopers.
Gary's part of the old guard that, the last generation of biologists that were working out here on the Platte and studied the swooping cranes.
Yeah, I actually flew for Gary for 4 years on the Hooper Watch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I was surprised, number one, that whooper stayed more than 1 or 2 days, because we had seen 2 whoopers the year before that. They were here for 1 day.
So how long did these stay for?
11 days.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
But anyhow, after I got to know Gary, he and I communicated quite a bit by text. But with the weather conditions, I was anticipating the whoopers may decide to migrate on Sunday. That would have been April 18th. And Gary had sent me a text telling me that weather conditions have to be just so for the birds to move on. He said when they do decide to migrate, they will leave the roost and go out to feed and return to the wetland to drink and preen. It has to be a clear day, southerly wind, usually for spring migration, and more times than not, the cranes will leave between 10 and 11 a.m. and would take flight calling and begin to ride the thermals to a few thousand feet high, and then drift off to the north and migrate until 4 or 5 p.m. when they would find a place to settle in and roost.
Yep.
So that was great information to get from him. And again, I was keeping track of where they roosted every night. Mike, for you, your crew was out.
We had our Platte Basin Timelapse crew come out
a couple different times. So
Did you
one
set
of them,
up cameras in?
We didn't set up any cameras. I think we all shot from the road and the deck, even maybe. I can't remember. I wasn't out then at that point, but it was Grant and Ethan.
and Dakota came out.
And
one
Dakota
morning
too. That's right. Yeah, got some
brought
great
his
stuff.
mother out.
Yeah, that's right. I remember that.
Well, the day the cranes did leave, I was watching these cranes all the time, and Dakota came out on Saturday, April 24th with his mother. Okay, and they were out, and we looked at the cranes, and they were over on our south property at the time. They were only about 250 yards off the road. So he was over there watching them, and then they decided they were going to leave about 9:10. Okay, so they went back to Lincoln. But I went down to the driveway, being the dedicated individual I am, to about 10 or 11 a.m. migration watch per Gary. And this is when I got, clarified about the southerly wind normally. And I think there was a light northerly wind that day, so that sort of threw me off. So I almost gave up watching. But about 10:05, the cranes flew back over to our south 80 and lit. I drove over by our south building and could see the cranes from there, so I sat in the shade of the apple trees with Jax, my dog, and watched from the car. The cranes seemed to be alert, and all 4 had their heads raised for at least 15 minutes when they took flight at 10:37. They headed back towards Holland's field, where they had been feeding this whole time, but then they banked to the north and started gaining altitude and circling. I was watching them through my binoculars and they gained altitude rather quickly, so I called Lisa to try and keep watch from the house. Once she had them in visual, I headed back to the house since it was closer to the cranes, but she had lost them with the naked eye and the wisp of the clouds, and I was unable to reestablish a visual. It all seemed to happen so fast, even though thanks to Gary, I knew what to expect and I was there to see it. It is a pretty empty feeling knowing they were gone after 11 days. All I can relate it to is the empty nest syndrome, where it was great having them around, but a lot of work with monitoring their status during all daylight hours. Great to see them finally go. It was a rather exhausting ordeal, but I know in the end we will really miss them being around all the time, as it was most likely a once-in-a-lifetime experience and a privilege I never thought I would experience, so I feel extremely fortunate and blessed. And then as a side note, Mike and I had been in close contact, and I sent out texts that a lot of people that they had left. And Mike was kind enough to get back to me later, telling me that they were up on the Niobrara River, is where they spent the night, by Stewart, Nebraska.
Yep.
And so you kept me posted on their travels from then on, which I very much appreciated. But it was a very unique experience, and I feel very fortunate that we got to see it.
Well, I think those birds are fortunate to be here and amongst you and Lisa. And I'll tell you that I'm so damn glad that you wrote all that down because you're a good writer, first of all. And second of all, that's a treasure. And I can tell you a little bit about the rest of the story with this bird if you're interested. And I'll do the same thing when we move to Rick's story about birds that we know together. So this bird, its call sign with the biologists is 14E. That's the telemetry number and letter that it was given. And, I know you have most of this information already, but I'll, for our listeners here, this bird was banded as a juvenile, as a chick, up in Wood Buffalo National Park, where all of the whooping cranes nest. This particular bird, though, has a wrinkle in its story. This bird, my friend Dave Brandt, who's been doing this work for a very long time, he named it Lone Juve, Lonejuv. And the reason he did that is that on this bird's migration in 2020, somehow it got separated from mom and dad. Now, usually that's a death sentence, because cranes don't have an innate sense where they're going, migrate. They have to learn it from mom and dad. And where'd mom and dad go? Nobody knows. But that bird showed up in Kansas alone, actually all by herself. And she ended up spending her winter with sandhill cranes at Quivira National Wildlife Refuge and then on private lands near the Arkansas. So everybody wanted to know at that point, well, what's going to happen to her in the spring? Well, she ended up migrating north. So she probably flew right over your house again. She probably flew right over yours too. And ended up going up and spending that summer on the Peace River in very remote wilderness territory. The Peace Athabasca River Delta is one of the largest freshwater deltas in the world. And it's true wilderness. And it's just south of Wood Buffalo. And that's where she spent her time. And so when I was working on this project, that bird was intriguing to me. I didn't know you at that point. She hadn't been here yet at that point. But on her fall migration, everybody wanted to know, well, is she going to migrate south again? And if she's going to migrate south, who's she going to go with? So 14E, Lone Juve, did migrate in the fall in 2020 and ended up on the Niobrara River. Her telemetry pinged in, and there she was. And wait a minute, was it Niobrara? No, it's in Missouri. She ended up on the Missouri because it was right across from the Santee Sioux Indian Reservation. And so the upper reaches of Lewis and Clark Lake. And this was in early November. And so my oldest daughter, Elsa, and I drove up there to go and see if we could find her. And we went to the South Dakota side. And we parked, and, over there you got these giant heaving hills, and you look down into this, huge river and floodplain you can see forever. And there she was. And she was there with two other birds. she ended up staying there a really long time. They were there for probably 2.5, maybe close to three weeks.
Oh, and two other birds you're talking
And
about.
two other
hoopers.
birds, yeah.
You're talking about whooping cranes.
Whooping cranes, yeah. So we saw her there, and then she ended up down in Texas. And the place that she winters down in Texas is on one of the barrier islands on the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge, but very remote. So it was cool as heck when the next spring she ended up at Dawn's here because, we had
We had 3 other birds.
right, yeah.
Huh.
So today she should be a breeder.
Mhm.
She's an adult now. She's 4 years old. And so, when we talked earlier, this might have been before we started here even, the telemetry signals, because they have to dump that data through cell tower. There aren't no cell towers up in Wood Buffalo National Park. There's nothing up there.
Right.
I mean, this is about as true wilderness as you're going to get in North America. And so once they leave their last signal coverage area, and they go dark, and you don't hear from them again until fall. So she very well could right now have a little one of her own. She could have a nest, could have a partner, or she could be on her own. We don't know. And we won't know until this fall when she starts migrating south again and pings in. And then they can look at that data on a map, and you can tell birds that are nesters because their world shrinks from 2,500 miles going up a big flyway to a 4-foot diameter nest in about a 2 square mile territory. So their movements off of that nest almost look like spokes on a wheel.
Oh, yeah.
Then at that point. So it'll be really fun this year to see what the biologists say when they look at her telemetry and tell us what the story is.
Definitely am interested in an update.
Yeah.
If
So how long do those batteries last?
They're solar.
Oh.
So they last.
Oh, so it's not like the old days where they just batteries would go dead and that was it.
But these units, though, they typically, some units will last longer than others, but I think their longevity is, and don't quote me on this, probably around 3 to 4 years.
Okay.
They can get about that much out of them, and they keep evolving that technology. So, but that's really, really cool. So we've connected these birds up and down a continent.
It's incredible.
Yeah. Well, let's shift gears, Rick, to your story about whooping cranes. So this last year, you started to engage with a pair of whooping cranes in your backyard.
I did. And it started with 4 whooping cranes that they actually arrived October 28th. And I heard that they were in the area where I lease ground. And I would see them once in a while flying out to the fields to feed. But also the land that I leased down there, the people that bought it for hunting rights. And I had some temporary blinds down there over the years with the previous owners, and the new owners were going to let me build permanent blinds down there. But they didn't want me down there messing around right before rifle season of deer because they didn't want me to spook the deer around. So they used the one cornfield the whole time they were here for the basically 2 months. They used the same cornfield to feed every day.
So hang on, you said how many months?
Well, let's see, it's October, so November, December. So over 2 months. Over 2 months, those birds were here. Actually, from October 28th to January 10th. One of the landowners said I got permission from him to put up a pop-up blind. So I did that for a couple of days and did get a few images of them flying over into the cornfield. But after deer season, then I was allowed to go down to this property. Well, in the meantime, I was going down there. I was going to build 2 new photo blinds. So I wanted to get the 4x4 posts in the ground before the ground froze. So I would go down there with my John Deere Gator with my postal digger and posts and camera and a tripod. And I would go down there and I would, get up next to the river and I would scope the river out and make sure the birds weren't anywhere in sight. Then I'd start digging the hole. So then all of a sudden I look up and here comes 2 hoopers and they come and land. So then I would just sit back and actually I just sat underneath of a cedar tree and just sat there and watched them for hours. And when they were here earlier, before the river started icing up, they would do what I call a walkabout. They'd start walking upriver, feeding, looking for snails. And actually, I got pictures of them actually catching small fish and eating fish.
Yeah.
And they'd get out of sight. Well, then I'd start putting posts in again. And I did this for several days. And it took me to put in just a few posts that normally would have taken me an hour. It took me 14 hours over 2 days. But so then after I got them in, I would go down there just about every morning. And I spent just about every day, probably about 7 hours a day on the river. If they weren't there, if they were a long way away, I would just patiently wait. And sometimes they would get close enough, but just the experience of watching them, it's just, so they actually arrived October 28th and they stayed till January 10th. They were here for over 2 months. I expected them to leave any time and they just never did. We had a blizzard. We had 7 inches of snow. They didn't leave. The river started freezing up. They didn't leave. We had another blizzard, another 8 inches of snow. They still didn't leave. And finally, on January 10th was the last day I saw them, and I saw them leave the river, and they never came back. So I just assumed they migrated then. And the next day was when we had at least a week or 10 days of sub-zero temperatures where it got super cold. So they were half the days. It was a long time.
That was the ice box at that point. I mean, you remember how cold it got in
yeah.
January for that length of time. And I think the day that I came out, I think our high was 2. And the river was starting, the river had fairy rings in it in the morning. And when they were walking, they were out there on the channel. They were in some slack water, but that slack water had ice on it. So they'd walk across the ice and then they'd break through.
You can see that,
and break through.
Yeah.
But I also think there's probably a spring source around there that kept some of that water open for them. But I'm really glad that they moved when they did, because if they wouldn't have moved that day, I don't think they probably would have. I mean, they're tough birds. They're a lot tougher than I think people think, but man, it got cold.
But it got cold.
And I do get into that story too. A friend of mine, Kevin, who's a guide down in Texas, he did see them on the refuge because this bird is a bird that has, its call sign is E56, and it has a gold and a yellow band. And that gold yellow band the telemetry with that bird hasn't worked for a long time. That's an older bird, and I can't remember how old it is, but she's been around a long time. And the funny thing about it is that in 2019, when I first started the first official trip on this book project for me was to photograph a family of whooping cranes that had come to the Crane Trust. Bryce Crone had seen them on their camera. They got a camera that looks over the river that you can see all the time. And he called and said, "Hey, they're here, and we got a couple of our biologists. It was Emma Brentley Buckley and Andy Caven. We're watching them from the blind. You got to come out." So I came out, and that was the first time I had seen a whooping crane family together on the river. It's the first time I'd probably seen whooping cranes in fall. And I'll be damned if it wasn't the bird that Rick was watching. It's the same bird. But here's the wrinkle, is that bird then was with another mate. That bird that's a female. Mm-hmm. And so so I don't know if the other one died or got too old or got too boring or what.
They got divorced.
But they could have gotten divorced. And they've switched. And so who she was with now is not who she was with then. But I ended up photographing her in 2019 with her chick and her mate, and what we think was probably maybe the chick of the previous year, because it kept sort of trying to hang around with mom and dad would keep shooing him off and he'd keep coming back. But I ended up finding that family back in the winter of 2019, 2020 down at Aransas on a territory, and then here she popped up again. So quite remarkable. Don read some great journal notes. Did you bring a picture?
Oh, I have all kinds of pictures,
Well, let's show Don a few of your pictures here.
but I have a lot of images of it. So this particular one here was actually when they were. Let's see if I could do. I can probably play. This one was actually when I was actually in my little pop-up blind along the cornfield before I actually could get down to the river. But listen, and I could flip through some. So this was just 3 of the 4 that were there, and I think the banded one wasn't there at the time. But I mean, it was with them, but it wasn't in the frame of the picture. But get down. I don't know if I have.
Just like paintings.
But just
So zoom in on the E56, the one that has her has the telemetry.
yeah, there's E56 there.
So, and I'll show you on the phone here. So this is.
I can't really zoom in on these.
Oh, that's okay. But that's her down at Aransas. And you can just see that yellow gold. That's her down there on her winter territory. So 2019, that was them at the Crane Trust.
Mm-hmm.
And there she is.
Yeah.
Same bird.
Yeah.
Isn't that something?
Yeah. You can really tell by the jewelry, by the bands.
Yep.
I mean, so if you can't read the number on it, it's you can tell by the colored bands.
And I should show you, Don, this is the area that your bird, Lone Juve, black, white, black, that's her territory in the wintertime. That's near a place called Vincent's Slough.
Looks a little nicer than here.
It's a lot lovelier than here. You know? Really good fishing too. If I had $1 million, I'd take you guys both down there to it probably wouldn't cost $1 million. I don't know, high taste and all, but it'd be fun to take you down.
We could try to make it.
Take you down there.
I'm a cheap date.
My buddy Kevin, I think he'd love having you guys on that boat. But
There's a picture of eating a fish.
yeah, so that's a question I want to ask both of you real quick about the whooping cranes. So you both watched and observed them quite a bit now. So you, in terms of what they eat, so Rick, you documented them eating a lot of fish.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think
sometimes I didn't know that I could tell they were prodding around trying to get something. A lot of times they're far enough away I didn't even know what they were getting until I took an image and zoomed in and saw the fish in their bills. But
well, I think that kind of documentation from a photographer, getting really clear pictures, not just of a fish, but even into what the species is really important for conservation of these birds today, because I think that's new ground. They knew that they ate fish. They eat a ton of crabs down south, and they're starting to learn more about what they eat up in wood buffalo, which seems to be a lot of insects, a lot of dragonfly larvae and such, but they're eating all the time up there. But the importance of having water in the river and healthy habitat on the river is critically important. That supports fish species of all kinds, and that's really coming to bear. And that's with sandtail cranes too. They're starting to see a lot more just through all the photographs that people are sharing with each other now. Able to dig in and see how important the fish community is for their diets. So I want to ask you, Dawn, in the 10, 11 days that you had the birds out here, we walked where they were, a couple of weeks later, looking for feathers. But what was your sense about what they were eating out there? What did you?
I didn't get any close up of what they were eating when they were in the wetland area per se, but they primarily fed in the one field to the west of areas they roosted in out here. There was only 2 exceptions to that. One day they were further south, and then the last day they were here, for whatever reason, they were roosting right out here about 300 yards east of our house.
Yeah.
And when they got up that morning, they actually flew north and lit in a field up there.
Mm-hmm.
It's the only time they ever went north.
And in a cornfield.
Yeah, in a cornfield.
Okay.
And I was watching them. But then they just bounced all around. They went out to feed several times, and then they finally left. So, but it's primarily the ag fields that I noticed, Mike, on that. So,
yep. The thing that struck me, being out here with you, we're in a agricultural landscape. We're in a land of corn and beans, So every square foot of nature matters
Oh, sure.
out here. And you can blow down the county road or down the interstate and look out and not see anything. But once you get in it and you spend some time, it's quite remarkable. And so every program that's out there, whether or not it's a CRP or wetland reserve or field corners or anything, all of that stuff matters, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I can honestly say this project here never would have come to be if it had not been for a Ducks Unlimited biologist. This property, this quarter section, was coming up for auction. This was back in 2002. And the regional biologist, who I knew quite well, still know him, he's not with DU anymore, but he called me and said, Don, he said, we're looking for somebody that's sympathetic to the Wetland Reserve Program cause to buy this ground, because they did not want somebody buying it and continuing to farm it. It was very marginal ground, as we've discussed before, but he said there's other properties in the area that want to enroll in WRP, but it's all hinging on this property. So I went to a DU sponsor banquet, totally had spaced off that Ryan had given me a call, but one of my friends said, hey, are we going to that auction tomorrow? I said, well, I hadn't really thought too much about it. So, of course, we had a drink or two and bankers in the group. And, hey, what if we need some temporary interim financing? Could we come to you? Oh, sure, no problem at all. So, long story short, we went to the auction the next morning. And my partner that I have now, there was a third person that had been farming the ground, and he wanted in on the thing too. So, we bought the property. And called my banker friend, hey, we need a check. So, but that was instrumental in this whole thing coming together for the Trumbull Basin. And this one was enrolled. The one across there was enrolled. The one straight south of here has always been, well, not always, but it's a native wetland that's never been disturbed, never been converted to agriculture. But before they did the restoration work, it had large dikes built all the way around it.
Right.
And every time it would rain, everybody around there would pump water into that. And same thing on this property. They'd pump it into a holding cell in the middle. There's a 30-acre holding cell, and they'd use it for irrigation. But when the restoration work occurred in 2004, 2005, between these three properties, they moved over 163,000 cubic yards of dirt. But it was quite a process. And I have a picture I'll show you later. I showed it to Rick a little bit earlier, but in May of 2005, we had a big storm in the area. We basically got 8 or 9 inches of rain, if I recall correctly, but they were out here doing all the restoration work. And this wetland basically went from being bone dry, to being totally full the next day. And the amazing thing, it still gets me when we get a good rain out here, is the frogs.
Yeah.
You don't hear a frog. Where do they come from?
Oh, I know. Yeah. So that was the spring.
Yeah, it was May of 2005.
That's a great conservation story. And that's how we do it here in Nebraska.
But I give DU a lot of credit for what they've done in the Rainwater Basin. Obviously, Rainwater Basin Joint Venture, NRCS helps out, of course, and funds the program. But we bought it with the intent of enrolling it in WRP, but it was actually 2 years from the time we bought it before we could get it enrolled and start the ball rolling. So,
Don, you touch people in conservation the way that you have the property that you have and the choices that you've made about the land that you love, and you've made it better. And not just for people around here, but for all the creatures that call this home, whether or not it's a temporary home in the spring or through the rest of the year. Because we oftentimes forget, we talk about spring migration, fall migration a lot, but nature doesn't stop when the birds leave. I mean, it's here year round, and you've done an amazing thing here.
Well, thank you. That was our intent going into the deal, and I was telling some of the group before about, it's beautiful, it's rewarding, but it's a lot of hard work.
Yeah.
Because you have to maintain spraying thistles and doing all the good stuff. But I know Andy Bishop was here 2 years ago. That was when we had water, so maybe it was 3 years ago. But he had a group that they were looking at doing potential projects on their property. Mm-hmm. And Andy, we were out on the deck because it was a really nice night. And he was just looking over this. He says, Don, this looks better than a lot of the other rainwater basin, wetlands in the area. I mean, so that was a huge compliment to hear that. And, it's all worth it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you're not just doing it with your head, but with your heart. And that's the thing. And Rick, humble as you are, you're a great photographer, and the work that you do and the way that you reach people, whether or not it's, through Facebook or it's through the gallery at the Crane Trust, or it's through the presentations that you give or the workshops that you have with folks, whether or not they're cranes or chickens or anything else, is that's touching a lot of people too, and it's doing good for conservation.
Thanks. Yeah. And when I take people out on my workshops and tours, I tell them it's like, this is all about the birds. I said, we're going to stay out here till the birds leave. And then since a lot of the wetlands have been dry, a lot of the sandhill cranes have been staying all day on the river. So now it's like, okay, we're going to have to crawl on our hands and knees to get out of here. I said, we're not going to spook the birds. I tell people it's all about the birds.
Yeah. And they never forget that.
Yeah.
They never forget those
definitely
experiences.
Don't do anything to take any risk to spook them.
Well, I really appreciate both of you, and appreciate you taking the time. And I am really grateful to know both of you. And
Feelings mutual.
Yeah, absolutely, Mike.
so let's keep on keeping on, right? And keep doing what we do. And I'm glad these birds brought us together. So thanks very much.
You bet.
Yeah.
Welcome. Yep.
This is the Whooping Crane Chronicles. In this podcast series, I will have conversations with the scientists, artists, landowners, and others that I have met along my journey, who all have a shared connection with their love for whooping cranes. Stay tuned, and thank you for joining.